You woke up this morning knowing exactly who you are. That's the problem. Not because you're wrong about the facts. Your name, your history, the coffee you prefer, the people you love, those are real. But underneath all of it, underneath the biography and the habits and the face you recognize in the mirror, there is something far stranger happening. Something that physics, philosophy, and a few brutally honest moments in your own life have been trying to tell you for a long time. You are not a fixed thing. And the certainty that you are, that quiet, unexamined assumption you carry from room to room, from year to year, may be the single most limiting belief you have never once thought to question. Here is the paradox that this entire video is going to live inside. The more confident you are about who you are, the less of yourself you can actually access. Identity, when treated as a conclusion, becomes a cage, not a dramatic, obvious cage. A comfortable one, the kind you stop noticing because the bars are made of memory. Who decided who you are? Not rhetorically, genuinely. At some point something collapsed, the way a wave collapses into a single position the moment it is measured, and you became this, rather than everything you could have been. The question is not whether that collapse happened. It did. The question is whether it was finished for you, or whether you were even in the room when it occurred. We are going to go somewhere most conversations about identity refuse to go. Not into self-help, not into personality typing or childhood wounds or morning routines. We are going into the structure of the thing itself, into what physics and philosophy, when placed side by side, reveal about the nature of a self. And what they reveal is simultaneously more disturbing and more liberating than anything a framework can offer you. Stay with the discomfort of that question for now. Who decided who you are? We will come back to it. But first, we need to understand why the question is so hard to answer, and why that difficulty is not a flaw in the question. It is the most important data point we have. Philosophy has been quietly circling this problem for centuries, and the most unsettling answer came not from a mystic, not from a poet, but from an 18th century Scottish philosopher who sat down one afternoon, turned his attention entirely inward, and came back with nothing. David Hume went looking for the self. He wanted to find it, the core, the essence, the thing that persists beneath all experience. What he found instead was a sequence, a rapid, uninterrupted stream of perceptions, sensations, memories, and thoughts, feelings passing like weather. No fixed observer behind them, just the passing itself. He called it the bundle theory, the idea that what we call the self is not a thing but a collection. A bundle of experiences occurring in sequence so quickly and with such apparent continuity that the mind constructs a narrator to explain them, a me to be the author of what is really just a river. There is no author. There is only the river. 2 centuries later, the philosopher Derek Parfit, one of the most rigorous thinkers of the 20th century, took Hume's observation and pushed it to its logical extreme. In his landmark work, Reasons and Persons, Parfit argued that personal identity is not what matters, that the thing you are so fiercely protecting, so carefully curating, so anxiously maintaining, the continuous, coherent you, is a useful fiction. A model the brain builds because a model is easier to navigate than raw, unstructured experience. Not a lie exactly, more like a map that has forgotten it is a map. And here is where it gets genuinely strange, because if the self is a constructed narrative, if the I is something assembled rather than something found, then the question is no longer, who am I? The question becomes, who is doing the assembling? What is making the decisions about which memories to keep vivid and which to blur? Which experiences define you and which get filed away as anomalies? Which version of you gets to show up in the morning? Something is editing. Something is curating. And it is not doing it consciously, because if it were, you would remember making those choices. You don't. This is not abstract philosophy. This is Tuesday morning. This is the moment you react to your adult child the same way your father reacted to you and feel a cold recognition afterward. That wasn't me, except it was. The edited version, the collapsed version, the one that got assembled somewhere along the way without your full participation, not a traumatic revelation. The structural one. The bundle theory doesn't say you are broken, it says you are built. And the difference between those two things is everything, because what is built can, in principle, be examined, questioned, rebuilt with more intention than the original construction ever allowed. But here is where the problem deepens into something philosophy alone cannot resolve. If the self is fabricated, if the narrator is a post hoc invention of a brain trying to make sense of its own activity, then we have a second question, sitting directly beneath the first, heavier and stranger. If the narrator doesn't exist as a fixed thing, what is doing the narrating? That question cannot be answered inside philosophy alone. To see it clearly, we need to walk into a laboratory, into an experiment so simple it can be described in a single sentence, and so disturbing that physicists have been arguing about its implications for nearly a century. The self, it turns out, may behave exactly like a particle. In 1801, Thomas Young aimed a beam of light at a barrier with two narrow slits cut into it, placed a detection screen on the other side, and watched what happened. What he expected was simple. Light passing through two openings should produce two bright lines on the screen, one from each slit. What he got instead was a pattern of alternating light and dark bands spreading across the entire surface, an interference pattern. The kind of pattern that only waves produce when they overlap and cancel each other out. Light was not traveling as a particle through one slit or the other. It was traveling as a wave through both slits simultaneously, interfering with itself, spreading across every possible path at once, and only landing in a specific location when it finally hit the screen. Both. And then one. Everywhere, and then here. That result was strange enough. But then, more than a century later, physicists refined the experiment in a way that made it philosophically catastrophic. They asked a simple question. What if we just watch? What if we place a detector at the slits to see which one the particle actually goes through? The interference pattern disappeared. The moment they observed which path the particle took, it stopped behaving like a wave and started behaving like a particle. It chose one slit. It became definite. The act of measurement, of observation, collapsed the superposition. It forced the system to stop being all possibilities at once and become one specific thing. Superposition. The technical term for this means that a quantum particle does not have a fixed location, a fixed spin, a fixed state until it is measured. It exists as a probability distribution, a field of potential outcomes, all equally real, none of them yet actual. The measurement doesn't reveal which state the particle was already in. The measurement creates the state. The observation is not passive, it participates. This is what physicists call wave function collapse. The moment a field of pure probability becomes a single concrete fact. But the physicist John Archibald Wheeler didn't stop there. In the 1970s and 1980s, Wheeler designed what he called the delayed choice experiment, a variation so conceptually unsettling that even seasoned physicists find it difficult to sit with. The setup simplified. A photon is fired toward the two slits. The decision about whether to observe which path it takes is made after the photon has already passed through the barrier, after it is, by any classical understanding, already committed to one path or the other. And yet, the result changes based on the later decision. The photon traveling through the apparatus appears to retroactively adjust its behavior based on a measurement choice that hadn't been made yet at the moment of its passage. The future observation reaches backward and shapes what already happened. Wheeler's conclusion was not that causality is broken. His conclusion was more radical and more careful. He said that the universe, at its most fundamental level, is participatory. That reality is not a collection of pre-existing facts waiting to be discovered. It is something that crystallizes, becomes definite, through the act of observation itself. He called this the participatory universe. A cosmos that is, in some deep sense, brought into being by the beings that perceive it, not created out of nothing, collapsed out of possibility. Now hold that image carefully. Don't let it become mysticism yet. Stay with the physics. A particle exists in superposition as all of its possible states simultaneously until the moment of observation forces it to become one specific thing. The observer does not merely witness. The observer determines. And the determination is not random. It follows the probability distribution, the internal structure of the wave function, the shape of all that accumulated potential. What collapses is not arbitrary. It is deeply mathematically structured. The possibilities were always weighted. Some outcomes were always more probable than others. The wave function is not chaos. It is organized potential. Here is what nobody says out loud in a physics class, because it sounds too much like the beginning of a conversation that left science behind. But it needs to be said plainly, without decoration. If the observer changes the observed, if the act of looking at something determines what it becomes, then the question of who is doing the looking is not secondary. It is the most important question in the room. And if you are the observer of your own life, of your own history, of your own interior experience, if you are the one turning attention toward the bundle of perceptions and memories that Hume described, then you are not a passive witness to a fixed self. You are the measurement event. You are the thing that collapses the wave function of who you could be into who you currently are. Every time you look at yourself and think, "This is who I am," you are not reporting a fact. You are performing a measurement. And like every quantum measurement, that act forecloses other possibilities in the same moment it creates a definite one. Observation doesn't just reveal, it decides. This is not metaphor stretched over physics to make it sound profound. The parallel is structural. The same logical architecture, superposition, observation, collapse, foreclosed possibility, appears in both the behavior of photons and in the behavior of human identity across time. That structural similarity is worth taking seriously, not as proof of anything mystical, as a frame that has genuine explanatory power, because there is a version of you that never collapsed, a version that remained probability, and something, a culture, a family, a failure, a success, a role you accepted without realizing you were accepting it. Something acted as the measurement event. Something looked at you at precisely the wrong moment, with precisely the wrong kind of attention, and you became definite before you were ready, or worse, before you had ever been asked. Who was the observer? That question is still open, but the physics has given us something essential before we move forward. It has shown us that the collapse of potential into definition is not a one-time, irreversible event ordained by nature. In quantum systems, superposition can be restored under the right conditions. Particles that have been measured can, in carefully constructed environments, return to a state of open probability. The wave function does not collapse forever. It collapses until the conditions change. This is the first real piece of good news in this entire conversation. And it arrives not from philosophy or spirituality, but from experimental physics. But like all genuinely good news, it comes with a cost. Because restoring superposition, reopening the field of possibility, requires something most people spend the second half of their lives actively avoiding. It requires the willingness to become undefined again. And that, for anyone who has spent decades building a coherent self, is not a small thing to ask. Let me be specific about what this looks like in a life, not in a thought experiment, in an actual human life lived across actual decades. Somewhere between your late 20s and your mid-40s, something shifted. It wasn't dramatic. There was no single moment you could point to and say, "There, that's when it happened." It was quieter than that, more gradual, more cooperative even, in the worst possible way. You started answering the question of who you are with the same answers, not because the answers were wrong, because they were convenient, because they worked well enough, because the people around you had organized their expectations around those answers, and changing them would have required a kind of disruption that seemed disproportionate to the discomfort you were feeling. So, you kept the answers, and the answers kept you. This is what psychologists call identity foreclosure, a term introduced by the developmental psychologist James Marshall in the 1960s, building on Erik Erikson's earlier work on identity formation. Foreclosure in this context means committing to an identity without ever fully exploring the alternatives, accepting the collapsed version, the one shaped by family expectation, cultural script, early success or early failure, and treating it as though the exploration was complete when in many cases it had never fully begun. Not a crisis, a quiet foreclosure. The people who experience this most acutely are not the ones who made catastrophic choices. They are the ones who made perfectly reasonable choices, consistently for 30 years, and then woke up one morning with a strange and sourceless feeling of loss. Not grief for something specific, grief for something unnamed. a sense that a door closed somewhere, and they can't remember walking through it. What door closed? And were you the one who closed it? Here is what the quantum frame reveals about that feeling that no psychological model quite captures. When a wave function collapses, when a particle goes from being a field of possibilities to being one specific thing in one specific location, the other possibilities don't disappear from mathematics. They become inaccessible. They exist, in a sense, as the road not taken, encoded in the structure of probability that was never actualized. The particle is here, but the wave that carried it was everywhere. You are here, but the wave that carried you was everywhere. That unnamed grief, that sourceless sense of a door you can't find, is not pathology. It is not midlife crisis dressed up in philosophical language. It is the accurate perception of a person who has become very definite, looking back at the field of probability they once were, and registering the distance between those two states. Not depression, recognition. And recognition is entirely different from despair, because recognition implies that what is being seen is real. You are not imagining the distance. You are not being dramatic. The collapse was real. The foreclosure was real. The question is not whether it happened. The question is what kind of observer you are going to be from this point forward. Because here is the thing about the quantum parallel that changes everything once you sit with it long enough. The particle doesn't choose its observer, but you do. You have been observed, measured, defined, collapsed into specificity, by parents, by institutions, by the version of yourself that needed to survive a particular decade. Those observations were real, and they shaped the probability field in ways that still operate beneath your awareness every single day. But none of those observers had the final word. They couldn't, because the final word requires your participation. You are the only observer whose measurement cannot be overridden. And most people, not out of weakness, not out of failure, but out of the entirely reasonable exhaustion of a life fully lived, most people hand that authority over without realizing it is theirs to keep. They let the accumulated measurements of other people's observations stand as the definitive result. They treat the collapsed version of themselves as the only version that ever existed. This is not a moral failure. It is a physics problem. The wave function was never designed to stay collapsed forever. The probability field was never meant to be a permanent address. What you are calling your identity, the stable, coherent, nameable thing you introduce at dinner parties and describe to your doctor and reference when you explain your decisions, is one actualized outcome drawn from a distribution that is still, at this very moment, mathematically intact. The other possibilities did not die. They were not measured. You stopped being probability and became definition. And the question sitting at the center of the second half of a life, the question that this physics, this philosophy, and this deeply strange moment in human history are all converging on, is not who are you? That question assumes the collapse is final. The real question is far more interesting and far more demanding. What would it mean to restore the superposition? That question doesn't have a comfortable answer, and we should be honest about that before we move any further, because the physics gives us hope, but it also gives us the full cost. Restoring superposition, returning a system to a state of open, unresolved probability, requires removing the conditions that caused the collapse in the first place. It requires, in quantum terms, isolating the system from the environment that was doing the measuring. And in human terms, that means something specific and genuinely difficult. It means tolerating for a period, not knowing who you are, not as a spiritual exercise, not as a retreat experience, as a lived, daily, uncomfortable reality. The willingness to say, the version of me that has been answering this question for 30 years may not be the only version that is true. That willingness is the beginning of what the physics would call restoring the wave function. And it is, without question, one of the hardest things a person can do after decades of coherent, functional selfhood. This resolves the question of why the grief exists, but it creates a larger problem directly beneath it, because now we need to understand what the self actually is at the structural level, not just what it does, not just how it forms, but what it is made of. And that answer, when it arrives from neuroscience and philosophy together, is going to be stranger than anything the grief prepared you for. William James, the psychologist and philosopher who is often called the father of American psychology, writing at the turn of the 20th century, made a distinction that most people have never heard of and that changes everything once you have. He separated what he called the E from the me. The me, James said, is the object, the accumulated self, the biography, the traits, the roles, the history. Everything you would write on a form, everything you would say in an introduction. The me is the collapsed version, the definite particle, the thing that resulted from all those measurements across all those years. The I, by contrast, is the subject, the pure act of awareness itself. Not the content of experience, but the experiencing. Not the thoughts, but the thing that notices the thoughts. Not the story, but the capacity to tell it. The I is not a noun. It is closer to a verb, a process, an ongoing event, rather than an accumulated object. James understood something that neuroscience would spend the next century trying to catch up with. These two things are not the same, and confusing them is the source of most of what makes identity feel both essential and imprisoning at the same time. The me can be measured, defined, and collapsed. The I cannot. 50 years after James, the neuroscientist and philosopher Thomas Metzinger arrived at a conclusion so precise and so radical that it still makes people uncomfortable when they encounter it for the first time. In his work Being No One, and the more accessible The Ego Tunnel, Metzinger argued that the self is not an entity. It is a model. Specifically, it is the brain's model of itself, a real-time simulation generated by neural processes to help the organism navigate a complex world, presented to consciousness as though it were the thing doing the navigating rather than the map being used for navigation. The self is a model that mistakes itself for the territory, the ego tunnel. The title itself is the image. Metzinger describes consciousness as a tunnel. You experience only what the model allows through. Everything outside the tunnel exists, but you don't have access to it. Your entire phenomenal reality, everything you have ever seen, felt, thought, or believed, has arrived to you pre-filtered through a model your brain built without consulting you, optimized not for accuracy but for survival and social coherence. You have never experienced reality directly. You have experienced the model's interpretation of reality, presented so seamlessly that the seam is invisible. This is not pessimism. This is the most useful thing a neuroscientist has ever said about identity, because it changes the question entirely. The question is no longer whether the self is real. The model is real. The tunnel is real. The experience is real. The question is whether the model is current. Whether the simulation your brain is running, the one it built from the data of your first 3 decades, optimized for conditions that no longer fully exist, refined for relationships and environments and threats that have significantly changed, whether that model is still the most accurate representation available, or whether it is, in a very precise and non-metaphorical sense, outdated software running on hardware that has continued to develop without it. This is where neuroscience hands us something extraordinary, because the brain, it turns out, is not the fixed organ it was once believed to be. The discovery of neuroplasticity, the brain's lifelong capacity to reorganize itself by forming new neural connections in response to experience, learning, and attention, overturned one of the most fundamental assumptions in the history of medicine. For most of the 20th century, the consensus was that the adult brain was essentially static, that after a certain developmental window closed, the architecture was set. You were, neurologically speaking, the person you had become. That consensus was wrong. The neuroscientist Michael Metzinger, among others, demonstrated through decades of careful research that the adult brain retains a remarkable degree of structural flexibility throughout life, that the connections between neurons, the physical pathways along which thought, memory, emotion, and identity travel, are not fixed. They are weighted, strengthened by repetition, weakened by disuse, capable of being redirected by sustained attention applied over time. The model can be updated, the tunnel can be widened, not easily, not quickly, not without the kind of deliberate, sustained engagement that most self-improvement culture reduces to a weekend practice. But genuinely, verifiably, measurably, the brain is not a photograph. It is a living document. And here is where the quantum frame and the neuroscience frame converge in a way that stops being coincidental and starts being structurally significant. In quantum mechanics, the wave function, the field of organized potential, is not destroyed by collapse. It is reduced, localized, made specific, but the underlying mathematical structure that generated the probability distribution remains intact. Under the right conditions, the system can be prepared again. The superposition can be restored. In neuroscience, the self-model, the ego tunnel, the brain's running simulation of who you are, is not destroyed by decades of repetition and reinforcement. It is entrenched, weighted towards certain pathways, made habitual. But the underlying neural architecture that generated the model in the first place remains plastic. Under the right conditions, novel experience, sustained attention, genuine cognitive challenge, the deliberate disruption of automatic behavior, the model can be revised. Both systems, same architecture, organized potential that was collapsed into specificity, retaining the capacity for reorganization, not identical processes, analogous ones. And the analogy matters because it points towards something that neither discipline names directly, but both imply. Identity is a field, not an object. It behaves like a field, distributed, dynamic, sensitive to observation, capable of existing in multiple configurations, collapsing into specificity under certain conditions, and capable of reorganization under others. It is not located in any single memory, any single belief, any single role or relationship. It emerges from the interaction between the model the brain is running and the observations, internal and external, that continue to shape that model in real time. You are not your biography. Your biography is one collapsed configuration of a field that was never, at any point, only that. Now here is the question that the neuroscience and the physics and the philosophy have all been building toward separately, without coordinating with each other. The question that sits at the convergence point of all three, and that is genuinely the most important question this video has asked. If identity is a field, what generates it? The model is generated by the brain. The brain is shaped by experience. Experience is filtered through the model. The model was originally constructed from observations made by others before you had the cognitive capacity to evaluate them. Those early observations weighted the probability field in specific directions. Those weights became habits. Those habits became character. That character became identity. And that identity became the lens through which every subsequent experience was filtered, evaluated, and either integrated or discarded. It is a loop, a closed, self-referential, self-reinforcing loop. And the only thing that can interrupt a closed loop is something that arrives from outside its own logic. In physics, that is called an external perturbation, a force or interaction that introduces new information into a system, shifting its probability distribution, reopening possibilities that the previous configuration had made inaccessible. In human terms, that external perturbation has many names. Sometimes it arrives as loss, sometimes as illness, sometimes as the end of a relationship that had been load-bearing for so long that its absence reveals how much of the structure was built around it rather than from within. Sometimes it arrives as a conversation, a book, a moment of silence that lasts slightly longer than comfort allows, and in that extra second, something slips through that the model had been successfully filtering out for years. The perturbation is not always welcome. It is almost never comfortable, but it is in every case the beginning of the same thing, the reopening of the field, the restoration of superposition, the moment when the collapsed version of you encounters the possibility that it is not the only version that is true. And here is what the physics adds that no purely psychological framework can offer. In quantum systems, the perturbation doesn't create new possibilities. It reveals the ones that were always structurally present, but had been made inaccessible by the previous collapse. The wave function that gets restored is not a new wave function invented from nothing. It is the original probability distribution, reorganized around the new conditions. You are not being asked to become someone else. You are being asked to remember that you were always more than the one who collapsed. The field was never destroyed. It was narrowed. This resolves the question of what identity is made of at the structural level, but it creates the largest problem this video has raised yet. Because if the field was never destroyed, If the probability distribution of who you could be is still mathematically intact beneath the entrenched model, then the question is not whether reopening is possible. The question is whether you have been the observer or the observed. Whether you have been the one performing the measurement or the one being measured. Whether the identity you carry was something you chose through genuine, deliberate self-observation, the I turning its attention toward the me with full awareness of what it was doing, or whether it was assembled by the observations of others, internalized so thoroughly and so early that it feels indistinguishable from choice. Most people, if they are honest, find the answer uncomfortable. Not because they were passive, not because they failed, but because the observations that shaped the model arrived before the observer was fully developed, before the I had the stability and the vocabulary and the critical distance to evaluate what the me was being told it was. The measurement happened before the instrument was calibrated, and an uncalibrated instrument, in physics as in life, produces results that are real but not necessarily accurate. Let me step out of the framework for a moment and speak directly, not to everyone who might stumble across this video, to the specific person who is still here at this point in the conversation, because the people who leave did so a long time ago, and the people who stayed are staying for a reason that has nothing to do with intellectual curiosity alone. You are somewhere in the middle of a life that has been, by most measurable standards, a real life. Not a rehearsal, not a preparation. A life with weight and consequence, and people who depend on you and decades of decisions that cannot be unmade. And inside that life, underneath the competence and the roles and the things you are genuinely good at, there is something that has been asking a question you keep not quite answering. Not a crisis, quieter than that. A sense that the version of you that shows up every day is both entirely real and not entirely complete. That the coherent, functional, recognizable person you have become is genuinely you, and also somehow a subset of you. That there is more probability in the field than the current configuration is expressing. You are not wrong about that. That feeling is not nostalgia. It is not the ego resisting the natural limitations of age. It is not ingratitude for a life that contains real love and real meaning. It is the accurate perception of a person who has been living inside a collapsed wave function long enough to sense the edges of it, to feel, in the quiet moments, the contour of the boundary between what actualized and what didn't. You felt the edges. You were right. The measurement events that shaped your model, the early observations, the internalized definitions, the roles you accepted because someone needed you to, and you were capable enough to fill them, those were real. Their effects are real. The model they built is real and functional and contains genuine truth about who you are. But a model is not a prison sentence, and a collapsed wave function is not a eulogy. The question that has been sitting underneath this entire conversation, the one you brought into the room before the video even started, the one that arrived not as a thought, but as a feeling you couldn't quite locate, is not whether you are allowed to be more than the current configuration. You are. The physics says so, the neuroscience says so. Every philosopher who ever looked honestly at the structure of the self said so. The question is whether you are willing to tolerate the specific discomfort of being undefined long enough for a more accurate model to form. Not forever, not permanently, not some endless dissolution of self into abstraction, just long enough. Long enough for the wave function to breathe. Long enough for the probability field to reorganize around something truer than the observations that arrived before you were old enough to evaluate them. That is not a small thing to ask. It is, in fact, an enormous thing, because the people at this stage of life who feel that quiet pressure, that sense of edges and incompleteness, have usually spent decades being reliable, being the one who shows up, being defined, because definition is what the people and institutions around you needed from you, and you provided it because that is what capable people do. Being undefined, even temporarily, even internally, feels like a betrayal of everything that was built. It isn't. It is the opposite, because a model that has never been questioned is not a strong model. It is a brittle one. And brittle things don't hold under the specific pressures that the second half of a life applies. The loss of roles, the shifting of relationships, the retirement of identities that were load-bearing for 30 years. The arrival of time that suddenly exists without a scheduled purpose to fill it. The people who navigate those transitions with the most integrity are not the ones with the most fixed sense of self. They are the ones who have learned at some point to hold their identity lightly enough to let it breathe without letting it dissolve, who have developed the capacity to be the I observing the me, the subject watching the model, rather than being entirely fused with the model itself. Not detachment, clarity. The distinction matters enormously. Detachment would mean caring less. Clarity means seeing more accurately, seeing the model as a model, the map as a map, the collapsed configuration as one true version of a field that contains others. And that clarity, it turns out, is not something you arrive at by thinking harder about who you are. It is something that emerges when you change the quality of the observation. When the eighteenth, William James's pure subject, the verb rather than the noun, turns its attention toward the me, not with the agenda of confirming what it already knows, but with the genuine openness of a scientist looking at data they have not yet interpreted. Observe differently, collapse differently. This still leaves the loop anchor open, because we have talked about what the self is, how it collapses, why it feels the way it does, and what the physics and neuroscience reveal about its structure. But we have not yet answered the question that opened this entire conversation, the one that has been running underneath every blocko like a current beneath the surface of a river. Who decided who you are? That answer is coming, and it is simpler than everything that preceded it, which is, in the end, how the most important answers always arrive. We started with a paradox. The more certain you are about who you are, the less of yourself you can access. Identity treated as a conclusion becomes a cage, comfortable, invisible, built from memory. We walked through Hume's river and Parfit's useful fiction. We stood in Thomas Young's laboratory and watched light go through both slits at once. We followed Wheeler into the delayed choice experiment and discovered that the future observation shapes the past event. We met Metzinger's ego tunnel and James's distinction between the I and the me. We traced the loop: observation, collapse, model, reinforcement, observation again, and found that the only thing capable of interrupting a closed loop is something that arrives from outside its own logic. And now we are here, at the answer to the question that has been open since the first 30 seconds of this video. Who decided who you are? The honest answer, the one that the physics and the philosophy and the neuroscience all arrive at independently from completely different directions using completely different methods, is this: no one decided. And that is the most important thing you will hear today. Not because the influences weren't real, they were. Not because the early observations didn't shape the model, they did, profoundly and lastingly. Not because the collapsed version of you is false, it is true as a wave function collapse is true, which is to say completely true within the conditions that produced it. But a decision implies finality. It implies that someone sat down, weighed the options, and chose this configuration over all others with the intention that it should be permanent. And no one did that. Not your parents, who were themselves living inside their own collapsed models, passing on the measurements that had been passed to them. Not your culture, which is a collective wave function running on historical momentum rather than deliberate design. Not the version of you that made the practical choices in your 30s, who was doing the best available navigation with the model that existed at the time. No one decided. It accumulated, and what accumulates can be examined. What accumulated without full awareness can be approached with awareness. What collapsed under conditions that no longer fully apply can be not undone, not erased, not replaced, but reopened, held more lightly, understood as one configuration of a field that retains its underlying structure. The wave function of who you are was never destroyed. It was never finalized. The measurement events of your life produced a real and valid result. The person reading these words, the person who has built real things and loved real people and survived real difficulties, that result is not the problem. The problem, if we can even call it that, is the belief that the result is the only result, that the collapse was the conclusion, that the definite particle is all that remains of the wave. It isn't. You were a field. You still are. The superposition was not lost. It was narrowed by observation, by the measurements of others, by the necessities of survival, by the entirely reasonable demands of a life that required you to be coherent and reliable and recognizable. But the underlying probability distribution, the mathematical structure of all the versions of you that the wave function contained, that structure is still present, still intact, still generating the quiet pressure you feel at the edges of the current configuration. That pressure is not nostalgia. It is not dysfunction. It is not the ego refusing to accept limitation. It is the field reminding you that it is larger than the form it currently wears. And here is the final turn, the one that closes every loop this video opened, including the one you may not have noticed was running. The question was never, who decided who you are? That was the surface question. The one the anxious mind reaches for when it senses something important is nearby, but can't quite locate it. The real question, the one beneath it, the one that has been generating the feeling of edges and incompleteness and sourceless grief, is this: who is observing now? Because if observation is what collapses the wave function, if the act of measurement is what turns probability into reality, then the observer you choose to be from this moment forward is not a passive role. It is the most creative act available to a human being at any age, but perhaps especially at the age where the collapsed model has had enough time to show you both what it contains and what it has foreclosed. You are the observer. You have always been the observer. The tragedy, if there is one, is not that others observed you before you could evaluate their measurements. That is simply the condition of being born into a world that was already running before you arrived. The tragedy, the only one worth naming, is choosing to remain inside the measurement someone else performed, long after you have developed the capacity to perform your own. Not a dramatic reinvention, not a dismantling of what was built, a change in the quality of observation, the eye turning toward the me with genuine curiosity rather than defensive confirmation, the subject examining the model rather than fusing with it, the wave function being held for once before it is collapsed, the possibility being inhabited for a moment before it is resolved into certainty. That moment, the pause before collapse, the breath before definition, the instant when the field is still open and the measurement has not yet been made. That moment is not emptiness. It is not confusion. It is not the absence of self. It is the self in its most complete form. Before it was narrowed, before it was made useful, before it was made legible to the world, at the cost of becoming slightly less legible to itself. That is who you were before anyone looked. And the extraordinary thing, the thing that Wheeler's participatory universe and Metzinger's ego tunnel and James's eye and Hume's river all point toward, each in their own language, without any of them having coordinated the answer, is that you can return to that moment, not literally, not by erasing what accumulated, but by changing the observer, by becoming the kind of eye that holds the me with enough space to see it clearly, rather than simply inhabiting it automatically. This is not transformation. It is not reinvention. It is not the beginning of a new chapter in the motivational sense of that phrase. It is the restoration of superposition, the deliberate, conscious, unglamorous act of refusing to let the collapsed configuration be the final word about a field that is still, at this very moment, generating more probability than the current form can express. You woke up this morning knowing exactly who you are. Maybe tomorrow, for just a moment, you wake up knowing that you are also everything you haven't measured yet. That is not a small thing. It is, in fact, everything. If something in this conversation shifted something in you, not a conclusion, not an answer, but a quality of attention toward your own interior, then the most useful thing you can do right now is not to resolve it. Sit with the openness for a while. Let the superposition breathe before you collapse it into a to-do list or a decision or a story about what this video meant. If you want to continue this conversation, the next one goes deeper into the structure of the observer itself, what it is, how it develops, and why most people never fully inhabit it. That video is already there. Find it when you are ready. And if something here resonated with enough precision that it felt less like new information and more like recognition, like something you already knew being said in a language you hadn't heard before, leave that in the comments. Not a summary, not a review, just the specific thing that landed. Those responses are how this conversation continues, and they matter more than the algorithm gives them credit for. The wave function stays open. That is the only instruction this video was ever trying to give.